Hi, all. This week we're going to be talking about conducting interviews, following up with this week 2 of the interviewing unit, really getting into the nuts and bolts of what you have to think about as you do the interviews and many of these additional methodological issues we're going to discuss this week. The first thing I want to talk about is the sampling challenges. There are a lot of different issues to think about. First, you need participants who will be able to give you detailed information about what may be, in some cases, very private issues. The idea in the interviews is you really want to get how people think about things, how they view their world. And for that, you have to have people who are willing to go with that. For that reason, you may not be able to get people just randomly as with a survey, but you need people who are interested in your research. As long as you don't overgeneralize the meaning of the research, it's not that much of a problem. The goal is getting the viewpoint of the people you interview. Even if they're not fully representative of the population, you're at least finding people who think the things you're talking about. And as long as that's of interest, you have a good interview. Now, you can either solicit participation through anything from handbilling, announcements. Sometimes it's just what they call convenience sampling, having people you know or have people you know recruit other people they know, what's also called snowball sampling. The other sampling techniques may be where there's a goal to get a diversity of views, sometimes the most interesting or the most extreme experiences, or sometimes just the most typical. Gatekeepers is another big issue. You're trying to figure out how to get access to the people you interview. Sometimes they're people you know or can get through people you know, but sometimes you have to get people who, whether it's members of a community, they're members of an institution, whether students, whether people in prison, whatever the issue is, there are people who may need to give you permission or give permission in a way that says you're an okay person to talk to. It's at least somebody in a position to allow you in or to recruit interviewees. They may be head of an organization or an influential member of that group. And just by getting their okay, it may get people willing to interview with you. But here's the thing, there are ethical issues when somebody is seen as giving you access. You want to make sure that the person giving you access is rewarding people for agreeing to be interviewed in ways that reveal who has actually participated in the study. You want to make sure there's anonymity with people who are giving permission, because otherwise the answers they give may be meant to please the gatekeeper, not to give honest answers to you. And you want to make sure people aren't feeling coerced to participate. You don't want a gatekeeper forcing people to participate. The next issue is how many people to interview, the sample size. Obviously, with the student papers you all are involved with, you're not going to be able to interview 30, 50, 60 people. But across the board, an interview is going to have a smaller sample size than, say, a large national poll. Depends on how many times you're interviewing each participant. The more in-depth you go with people, probably the fewer people you can interview. But more interviewers in the team, especially if you have a larger research project, allows a larger sample that may be necessary, especially if there's any statistical analysis involved. But for your average sort of interview research, paper in a sort of academic environment, or even in many sort of applied research, 15 to 30 participants hopefully gives you a diversity of viewpoints that can add up to a significant addition to knowledge about whatever issue you're doing the project. Now, before you prepare for data collection, you have to do a few things. You want to practice the interview as much as possible. It does take skill to do a good interview. You want to make sure you've sort of prepared yourself, you've thought about what you're trying to get from people, and think about what kind of follow-ups you may or may not end up doing. You often want to practice on people you don't know quite as well, because if you know the person too well, they know what you mean, they'll understand what you're implying. you want to make sure that whatever you say, the other person is hearing what you meant them to hear, not just what you intended, because what is said versus what is heard are not always the same thing. If you have a partner in this, you can reverse roles, see how each feels about the interviewer and the interviewee position. The other thing, make sure you have the right equipment. You need something to record the interview. You often, hopefully, have a smartphone or something equivalent available, but make sure it's set up to record the interview with decent quality. And you have to find a decent, comfortable place to conduct the interviews. You don't want too much background noise or it'll interfere with the recording. You want to make sure it's a place that makes the people you're interviewing comfortable. Data collection. This is the process of interviewing, but as you do it, you have to be conscious of the data you're collecting. And the main thing you need is what's often called rapport, a relationship of trust with the participant, which involves mutual respect, so they feel that you're listening to them, that they understand that you'll treat whatever they say with respect, and they care about your project, hopefully, so that they want to believe that you'll do something important and interesting with it. You want to be polite and enthusiastic, which is part of making them feel that this is a project that's worth their time. You want to have appropriate dress for whatever you think will create this system of mutual respect. And inevitably, you're going to start with something a little bit more casual to loosen up the relationship before you get to the deeper questions. You don't want to be too blunt on your first question or two. You want to warm up to it before you get to some of the questions that are really the heart of the research question you have. And concentrate on the participant. Express empathy for the things they say, especially when they're very personal. And try to keep any personal disagreement, and especially any disdain or horror or anything else that you might have if somebody says something you don't expect, to yourself. You want to make sure they feel comfortable saying it, and you don't want them to feel bad about it because otherwise they're just going to clam up. And the thing is, you want to make people feel that you believe them, even if you don't, just because you want them to understand that this is something that they can say, that you'll hear them out. And if you have later qualms about it, you can express that in your write-up. But as you do the interview, both verbal, nonverbal cues should say you believe what they're saying. Finally, be comfortable with silence. People won't always ask what you mean. They won't always ask for follow-up. They're sometimes thinking about what you asked, and it may be uncomfortable. So let participants pause. Give them time to pull together what they're thinking. If they have a question, they may eventually come out with it, but it may be just they're saying something hard. Give them the space to do that. Don't jump in with a follow-up question always right away, even if they're quiet for, half a minute or even a minute sometimes. Just be empathetic, appear to be ready to listen to whatever they're going to say. The next step is you really want to ensure the quality of research. And that means making sure the interview goes as well as possible, that you're getting the best, most truthful answers. You want to also audio record the interview, making sure that you have the best quality possible. It's hard to keep up with writing when people are speaking. It interferes with the rapport. And if you can't record the interview, write down key points. Make sure you keep concentration on the participant. Most questions you ask should be open enough, not yes or no questions. If any question you ask can be answered with a yes or no, rephrase it so it encourages people to give a broad, what do they mean by it? How do they think about the question? Something that's much broader than just confirming or negating whatever you said. You can ask about a specific situation, not just how do they feel about it, but can they think of a situation where something involving your research mattered in their lives? Elicit these rich details. Those rich details are the main point of the interview. If you are asking about demographic details, how old people are, how much money they make, what race they are, their religion, Save those generally for the end of the interview, not the beginning, just because you don't want that to be the focus of what they're thinking about, even if it's important to you. Don't put words in participants' mouths. This goes with the yes and no question thing. You want to make sure that the ideas, the diversity, the new things they may say that surprise you are coming from them, and that you're not foreclosing it by seeming to indicate exactly what answer you want. And you can always ask at the very end of any interview, is there anything else you want to add? Is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have asked? People often have ideas about how you should have done your own interview. And immediately after the interview, write down your impressions. What people said, do you think they might have been saying something that was untrue? Or what was the most important thing they said? Whatever comes to mind that wasn't captured immediately, make sure you get it down so when you write things up, you won't forget how you were thinking about the details people were giving you. Now, when you do these semi-structured interviews, the idea is you try to memorize the questions as much as possible. Only glance at it like it's a cheat sheet. Word questions in a relaxed way so that it invites a conversation, that it's not too formal. Link any follow-up questions to what participants have already said. Don't repeat something that they've already answered. Make sure you say, as you said before, do you have this to add? Is there any clarification? Is there any variant that you can do the question? But you always want to be acknowledging what they already said to lead to whatever follow-up questions you have. This is part of it. Don't ask a question if it's already been answered. If it was folded into what they said, you can skip it. Although if there's some part of the earlier question that they partly answered, but have some part they didn't answer, ask the part they didn't answer. While you should have some basic idea of the order of questions, be flexible. If the conversation is going in a certain way, you can move a few questions around to make sure it's as organic a conversation as possible. Now, when you're doing loosely structured interviews, you know what you want to explore, but you let the participants drive the conversation. 80% of the questions should flow from what that participant says. That's where it's very different from the semi-structured kind of interview you're doing for the research project for this class. But it also means you have to sort of think about what they're saying, ask new questions on the fly, focus on the information of what the respondent indicates is important. See if you can drill down. And that's one of the great things you get out of those loosely structured interviews, sort of going in depth where the participants think is most important. You may have a broad overarching theme you're exploring, but you can go into a lot of depth with what those people you're interviewing think flows from those broader questions. And you have to listen carefully because each question is going to be formulated based on what you just heard. And if you have some general questions, you can always come back to them if the conversation lags. Now, for any kind of interview, the most important part of data analysis ends up being the transcription in many ways. I mean, it's a certain amount of dog labor to transcribe an interview, but you want to do it as soon as possible. If there's a problem in the recording, if there's crackling, they're more likely to remember what somebody was saying if it's a little obscured. Transcription can be time consuming, so give yourself some time to do it. There is some software that helps, but none is perfect yet. And if you find anything that helps you, you can use it. But generally, you really want to spend the time because here's one of the things. As you transcribe it, it helps you think and focus on what you've heard. You may get some ideas on saying, oh, this is a lot like what another interview you then transcribe, which leads us to the next step. In data analysis is coding. Coding is a more formal word for just seeing the pattern. It's what's often called inductive thinking, looking at the evidence and seeing what are the structures that are there. Understanding flows from the data. You identify themes that have recurred in interviews. See if there are things that are in one interview and another interview or another interview. And if you see it, you code. It's in here and you start to see, are there patterns? Are there 1 to 4 word codes connected to sections of a transcript. Some codes you will have before you even conduct the interview based on the research questions you have. You're expecting to see certain things. If you see them, great. If you don't, it may make you think, here's another way to code what's there. And as you read the transcripts, there'll be a lot of new evidence and new patterns you see. You'll think about how to code for them. With multiple interviews, you really want to try to keep the code consistent. Because if somebody says something in one interview and somebody else says something similar, you want to make sure you're treating them largely the same. Now, how to look for patterns in codes. You'll have some initial hunches and see if those are backed up by what you see coded in your interview. And this is going to be true in any research you do. You have a hypothesis usually going into the interview. You have what you expect to find. Diligently look for things that contradict that hypothesis. Look for negative cases that contradict those hunches. Going in with that good faith effort is what most makes sociological research systematic, quasi-scientific, because you actually take your hypotheses seriously enough to look for things that contradict them. Write memos as you look over the interviews, note ideas coming out of those patterns, and possibly new leads for research in the future. You can also analyze how things were said, as well as what is said. If people laugh or say it somberly or indicate something is important, you want to take it that way too. Make sure the emotion people give to an idea is included when you write it up. And look at the sequence. What happened first, what comes next, especially when people are talking about a process. That sequence of events should be noted as well. And again, there's computer software out there that can help organize data for analysis. That's more important when you have a lot of interviews and you're starting to lose track of it, especially, but it's still there, and increasingly people use software to help them track and look for these kinds of coding patterns. Here's the thing, there is a key timing in data analysis. One of the things about interviews is you're doing some of the analysis as you do the interviews. It may influence doing a follow-up question. It'll influence how you do the next interview as well. New questions may arise that may influence both that interview and further interviews. By looking at the follow-up questions you can do, it can also help you analyze the answers to some of the earlier questions as well, to deepen what people said so you get clarification. You can always ask people at the end their interpretation and whether your interpretation of what they've said makes sense given their experience. You remember with Arlie Hochschild, she'd often say, I went back to people and said, does this make sense as an explanation? And that's a fine thing to do. Like, you have the people there. If you have a hypothesis about what they mean, ask them at that time. It's a good way to make sure that you're getting it right. Now, here's the idea. Part of when we talk about conceptualization and operationalizing any sort of research question you do ahead of time. It helps you think about the questions to ask. But as you're doing coding, that process is still there. It's helping you develop precise definitions of many of the abstract concepts that came from your research question. Operationalizing is deciding how to measure those concepts. So the goal is looking at the interviews, and the results of those interviews may help you rethink what the concepts were that you're looking at, and develop the terms and the patterns that help you highlight whether those concepts actually were in the interviews. Participants may supply new ideas that help operationalize the original concepts. Coding is often moving back and forth between the concepts you started with, how you operationalize them in the questions, and how the patterns that are in the actual transcripts make you rethink what you did. Now, here's the thing. Once you have everything down, you have to evaluate the quality of the data and make your analysis. Your core question is, did the interviews reflect the experiences and perspective of the participants. Were they giving you their honest view of that? The more you have concrete details, not just an opinion, but details that add up to a life experience, that's really the best indication that you're capturing something real in people's lives. The less talking by the interviewer, the more answers by the participants, that's the other indication. People, once they start talking, start to tell a full story of their lives, is far more likely to be real than a one-sentence answer of their opinion. Now, participants may not be confident, but nothing they said should ever be used against them. You want to make sure that they definitely feel that if they said something, it's going to be private between you and them. And that's one of the key to making sure you get quality data. And finally, you want to make sure that the patterns you're seeing are real and valid across those interviews. Part of that is looking for evidence of negative cases, as I've said. If you have a pattern, you want to make sure that you're looking for the things that break the pattern. You don't want to over-interpret your data and, as they sometimes say, torture the data to find a pattern that doesn't exist for everything. And it's okay to have things not fit the pattern. That's just grist for more research to say, what was different about them? What made them break the pattern? Because that can actually have some of the greatest insight you can hope for. Finally, you're going to be presenting the results. Presenting the results has a few factors. You're going to discuss your research question, why it was important, what was the background that led you to ask the question. Describe all of the methods used to collect the data, including the sample, and emphasize the limits on that. You don't want to try to say a sample was better than it was. Just say these were the limits, but here's what you did have. Discuss the patterns you found in the data. Present the quotations that illustrate the pattern. The greatest data you have in an interview are the things people say. You want to make sure, don't just say people said something, and in your own words. In this case, getting the quotations that will speak for themselves, that will make the reader say, oh, that's what they said. That's really important and interesting. I wouldn't have thought somebody would say something that way, but the fact that they did will speak for itself. So have as many rich quotations that really illustrate your point. You can explain what the code was and what the patterns were, but it's better to let some of the quotes speak for themselves in any presentation of an interview. And as I said, discuss the negative cases that contradict your hunches or patterns and say that's going to raise research for the future. And that's part of it. End any research, not by saying you've solved all the problems of the universe, but here's what you found. Here are the implications for the next step of research. Adding another perspective on doing interviews, we have the piece, In Their Own Words, Making the Most of Qualitative Interviews by Robert Weiss. He emphasizes what some of the key skills for interviewing are. It's more than just being a good listener. You have to choose the interview subjects carefully. Like, yes, you're listening, but you chose who to listen to, and you can't underestimate that. And nobody reading your research isn't going to say, why did you choose these people? So be upfront about that, and hopefully you pick good people. The biggest thing, always push for concrete details. Lots of people have interesting opinions, but what's more and deeper is having the concrete details that create a life story. People, when you do interviews, they look over reams of transcripts to develop the stories that are common across their interviews. If you do this well, you end up with a rich and compelling understanding of people's lives. Weiss emphasizes the challenge of getting honesty in interviews. Some respondents just plainly lie. You can see he tells a story about interviews with terrorist leaders about their funding sources, where it's clear they're not telling the truth. And the memory of an event never simply replays for people like a mental videotape. People don't always tell what happened exactly as it did happen. People assemble fragments of images, emotions into a story that may only partly reflect reality. Again, he tells a story about people being interviewed and remembering they met Bugs Bunny at Disneyland, even though Bugs Bunny wasn't there, based on various false advertisements they were shown. So it's very easy for people to tell a story that's not exactly true. So how do you overcome this distorted memory or just plain out dishonesty? First of all, focus and ask people how sure they are of their facts and memories. Again, getting a density of detail is not just a good story, but people have the most details on areas where they actually are remembering it best. The less detail they have on a memory, the less likely it's to actually be fully accurate. And the best thing you can do is combine interviews with other data, both from their lives, from any other source you have that reinforces the accuracy of the details people give you. People's own observations can indicate whether the participant was evasive, if they lack confidence, or just seem not very honest about it. Now, the other thing you can do is you can build a useful interview partnership, making the person telling their stories feel they have a stake in what you're doing. And if they think your research question is important, they'll understand why honesty is important. That's what consent forms do. They're not just there to sort of promise safety. They also are a way of building trust that you take their safety seriously. Again, encourage details, not generalization. While you want it to be in some sense conversational, there's no mistaking it's not a normal conversation. The interview presses for details that in a regular discussion, if the person didn't want to talk about it, you'd probably let go. So here's some keys to shaping a study. You want a sample of cases reflecting a range of people engaged in whatever activity you're being studied. He does note when you're just getting people because you know them, because they're easy to get to, you have to be cautious because exactly what makes them easy to get to may mean that they're not the full diversity of people. The people who may be most important to talk to may not be easy to get to. The more varied the population, the larger the sample needed. If you're talking to a small group, you can talk to a smaller set of folks because the diversity may not be as large. But where there's a great diversity of views within a community, you want more interviews. The capacity to do interviews limits the breadth of study ultimately. You want to make sure that you do only as many interviews as fits the study, and that the question, is not so broad that the number of interviews you're doing can't match that breadth. A very straightforward, limited, although not necessarily intellectually limited study that focuses on key people that can answer the question is the most important and the best way to approach it. Finally, when you're analyzing the data, Weiss argues you need to sort the data, then integrate it. Make sure that this is what we've said about coding. You want to make sure that you've found the patterns, broken it up into the parts that can then be reassembled into these broader patterns. Look at the responses, put them into categories, compare them to the other categories you have in your research. Reflect carefully on bias, your bias, potential bias of the people you're interviewing. What were your theoretical commitments, i.e. your hypotheses, and how did that influence your analysis? It's critical that you look for examples from interviews that contradict those initial assumptions. It's worth repeating that over and over again, that you really think about, is there anything that contradicts what you expect to find? And finally, you want to judge a study's usefulness. Why did you do it and why does it matter? Did you have the breadth of people in the sample that would make what you found really reflect the diversity of the community that you want to study? Was it done in a setting that encouraged accurate reporting? Did the interviews cover the relevant topics, or did you look at it at the end and sort of say, I missed a whole area of importance that we really didn't touch on? And do you have concrete citations, the words of the participants, the details that make it compelling? And does the data you lay out reinforce the study's conclusions? So, for a good example of how to think about methodology, had you read Mary Waters' Black Identities, West Indian Immigrant Dreams, and American Realities, her methodological index. It's interesting because it's actually a story she tells about doing the research. And the challenges she went through is a good roadmap for thinking about what you should be thinking about as you do any interview. There are big questions on methodology she lays out. How to preserve her safety in what, in many cases, were crime-ridden neighborhoods. How to do research in workplaces without managers controlling interviews, or in schools without school administrators controlling them. Can a white woman studying racial identity and racial relations do this with a Black population? When you pay respondents, how does that affect the research? How does it affect it? How do you diverge from what you said you were going to do in a grant proposal based on what you find in the field? And as you spend time, how much do you get involved in the lives of those you study? The goals of her study were pretty clear: to interview people in the context of where they were and interview others around them. So in some ways, she was going beyond traditional interviews, as we'll talk about, almost verging into participant observation and ethnography, as we'll talk about in more depth in coming weeks. What she was really trying to get is, how do people perceive how others see immigrants? And how do those others actually perceive themselves and those observing them? The immigrants she was looking at were largely Black Caribbean immigrants into often an African American community. She wanted to interview at work sites initially to look at how people, and especially these immigrants, overcome racial segregation in the work sites and in residential housing. She wanted to have middle-class work sites and a workplace with a mix of unskilled working class folks of multiple races. She also wanted to talk to the children of the immigrants interviewed. That was the goal. As she notes, you don't always get access to where you'd like to be. She tried to get approval at a hospital as a good place, which would be multiracial, have multiple classes of people, but she couldn't. As she details, there was some suspicion that she was there to look into corruption or other financial problems, since there were other government investigations looking at hospitals at the time. Some people thought she should just go through community leadership before doing any interviewing. She finally decided that the best approach was a public school, where there'd be multiple generations working in the school, and many of the students would be there as well. She had trouble getting approved, but she finally got in. And as a companion, she finally lucked into a corporate employer that had unskilled West Indian employees. Choosing a sample was definitely one of the bigger challenges. Her ideal might be to have a random sample in a school where she was doing most of her interviews. But the problem with a random sample was that would involve only kids who could get permission slips approved by their parents. Inherently the most responsible group, while the kids who couldn't get permission slips might have been some of the more interesting ones to talk to. So she ended up with more of a snowball approach, to find kids with a variety of issues and backgrounds. The school actually pushed her to include Haitian students in her sample, even though her original purpose was to look at other Caribbean immigrants. But if she had singled out some immigrants and not others, it might have caused tensions within the school. So she included them, even though her initial funders hadn't intended for her to interview them. She went with what the school. She was also offering $10 per interview, so a lot of students wanted to get interviewed. She wanted to get as representative a sample as possible. which included also some of the kids who didn't seem to have any parents either in the picture or likely to be involved. So she had to interview some children without parental permission. In some ways, a big no-no, and we can talk about that in the ethics part. She also, as she did the interviews, found that a number of people were saying, you're at the public school, but there's a chunk of the Caribbean immigrant community that are over in the church-based schools. And if you're not talking to them, you're not getting a representative sample of the diversity of the community. So she worked to expand the sample based on the information she got while doing the first set of it. Waters had some inherent challenges in doing these interviews. The first, when she was in the school, finding space to interview students. She ended up picking out a space largely in the lunchroom where she could actually recruit new students, be seen as part of the community, but that had its pluses, minuses, as she described. She also had the core issue of building rapport as a white adult with largely African American or Afro-Caribbean students. She at first thought being another working class kid from the surrounding Brooklyn community would help get her an in, but she actually found that being seen as an outsider from Massachusetts made her more interesting and often gave her more entree. She also had a Black Harvard student working with her to do interviews with the kids. He was there to both find them and help vouch for Waters. She used the research assistant for about a third of the 202 interviews she did. That's actually a lot of interviews for any interview research project, but that does raise issues of consistency. Looking back at the results, they found that the interviews done by the Black assistant elicited more anti-white sentiments and elicited more experiences with discrimination from the African American students. Interestingly enough, there was far less inconsistency with the immigrant students who came from the Caribbean. That itself is an interesting research result, although it does mean they have to look at the interviews with African American students done by Waters, ask what might have been at play. At least one of the issues may have been the attitude of the students towards Waters, although it may have also been Waters' attitudes as well. Raises the issue of you always have to be thinking about your bias as an interviewer and how that may be affecting both the answers you get and the questions you're asking and how that may change the information you get. Here's the question that's raised. Since she was actually placed in the community, sometimes in the lunchroom, was seen almost as part of the community, there is the issue of, was this just an interview project, or does it become at some point an ethnography, a participant observation project? She was at the institution over time, so it did seem almost more than just a set of interviews. It does have that element of ethnography. She interacted with students and teachers. And what it did give her was observations not just from the individual interviews, but somewhat about the interactions between people, a classic part, as we'll talk about in coming weeks, that you get from ethnography. She also did have some core safety issues she had to worry about. There were concerns about personal safety, that of assistants, where she was meeting with people, when she met, especially away from school. She had some stories about meeting with some of the workers at the one workplace she ended up doing where that was raised. She also had to pay interviewees in cash, and just carrying a lot of cash around could raise concerns. There is the core methodological issue, and she doesn't shy away from talking about it, that when you have a white interviewer studying Black students, that raises a whole set of issues. Can white interviewers really understand race relations in the lives of the Black students and the Black adults that she talked to? Will a white interviewer actually get honest answers on race? And will the analysis of a white researcher distort the evidence found in the interviews? But the counter to that is, does it mean you only can have insiders study insiders? And would that mean that Blacks could only study Black topics? The interesting question here was also you had multiple groups. You had white interviewer, You had African American students and sometimes adults, and Black immigrants from who were often had a very different view and tensions with the other communities. So there was no simple outsider insider, but actually multiple groups often in play. It also raises, should women only study women, and so on. I mean, there's lots of different issues about hierarchies and who's most insider, and even will Black researchers have an insight even on white communities that a white researcher wouldn't have, just by the nature of inequality in society. And these are issues that play out in lots of different discussions about how to think about methodology, especially on issues that are so hard as race in our society. Not to answer anything, but it's worth raising that there are multiple issues that people have explored on this methodological problem. The core thing is researchers have to recognize their own stereotypes, their own biases, and as much as possible, move beyond them. And there is the problem of there are stereotypes that came out through the interviews, negative stereotypes by some of the immigrants about the African Americans, and Waters had questions about how much she even wanted to repeat those in the research she did. This gets to the issue of your responsibility for, or do you want to perpetuate stereotypes even as you do research? So that brings us to the range of ethical issues she laid out. The first biggest one was she was offering $10 for an interview, which caused conflict in the families, where parents often didn't want to give a permission, but just having $10 on offer may put a lot of pressure by the children to say, let me do it. That really raises the issue of power by a researcher. Those with money can go in and they get to tell the stories of a community, stories that the community might want to tell about themselves, but don't have the resources or social privilege to have those stories told. The other issue was she did make all the interviews anonymous, especially worrying about possible issues with undocumented immigrants in her study. She didn't even want to write down their names anywhere, but her funders, in order to reimburse her for the interviews she did, wanted the names of people she interviewed. So she had to write them down just for the funders. But that did raise issues of exposure and if anybody else tried to get hold of those names. She also did have many controversial stories told, such as abuse within families. And there was the issue of whether she was going to write those down, especially if they didn't have much to do with her core research project. And in many cases, she didn't tell those stories because she didn't think they were relevant. And again, it's a question of what stories you tell on behalf of people when it doesn't serve your particular research. Okay, that all said, the water story gives you a number of methodological challenges, resolutions, and questions that illustrate the broader issues we're talking about of the challenges we have in doing any kind of interview project. We'll see what she talked about, especially what she talked about with participant observation, melds into other issues we talk about as we move into other research projects. That's all for this week.